So we ready to go?
Yeah, I guess
You
it's
always correct me when I would say something about the Air Force. You were in the Army, right?
correct. Yeah,
And we were in ROTC. Well, I'll give the introduction. You can correct it once again.
sure.
Okay. So, should we begin? All right.
Now, Bob, I
Yeah.
just want to ask you first. Now, I don't, I don't have to call you President, uh, Mr. President today, right?
No, no, no. I'll explain that in the intro. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I notice you're not wearing your jacket. You're not looking very official. All right, look,
No,
this
I'm
is an interesting uh, class to have, and we're going to discuss, the whole thing of the contours of change. We've talked about Orwell and Huxley and whether the public gets the accurate information it needs to make intelligent decisions, and the need for an enemy, as projected by Orwell as a unifying way, whether it's a real enemy or a made-up enemy or so forth. And so that's really what we're doing here. Last week we did China, and now we're going to do Russia because that's the another center. And next week we'll do the Arab-Israel war as three examples of how we rally a nation around some notion of its nationalism, threats to its security, and so forth, and to what degree is it consistent with a democratic society. And I'm very pleased to have Ray McGovern here. And let me just say, on a personal note, we both come from this little village called the Bronx, which is near Manhattan in New York. And we both are of the point of view that the Bronx was the center of American civilization and still is. And but we had very different trajectories. I grew up in a more leftist uh, part of the Bronx, more Jewish part was. People were more inclined to be well, more receptive of what was then considered more liberal leftist ideas. And Ray grew up in, I don't want to get this wrong, but he grew up in a Irish neighborhood and was maybe in certain ways more conservative. And but he's a much younger person. What are you now, 84?
85.
85, my God, you're catching up. So he's 3 years younger than me, but really quite a different trajectory. I went to City College in New York and ended up becoming quite radicalized by the experience. And we all thought we were at the best college in the world, but it was a college known for dissent and questioning, a big public university, the Harvard of poor people's Harvard, we all refer to it because and Harvard would discriminate against people of our background anyways. That's everybody forgets the good old days. And Ray went to Fordham University, which is in the Bronx, and a very well-known university. And instead of being radicalized, he went into the ROTC, was it?
That's right.
Yeah. And then went into the U.S. military's career. By the way, you could do that at City College too. Colin Powell, who ended up being a very famous general and then Secretary of State, was in my class in engineering at City College, and he also went into ROTC and went into the military. So I'm exaggerating the differences, but nonetheless, Ray went into the Army intelligence, and so forth, and then stayed in that area of life. He went to work for the CIA. This is our second. We had John Kiriakou here before, so this is our second CIA veteran in this class. And he spent 27 years in the CIA. And during that time, he became well, I'll let him describe it, but the head of the section of analysts dealing with the Soviet Union. And he's fluent in the language and he studied the area. And he ended up being the briefer to, is it five presidents or there
Th
five,
three, three,
three?
three.
Oh, okay. What? Reagan, Bush,
No, it was Nixon, Ford,
Nixon.
and Reagan one on one.
Ah. So, but we do a show together each week called Playing President, where I pretend to be the president and Ray is briefing me, just as a little aside. I have followed Ray's work for a long time and with great respect. And he's been a very important critic, beginning with, I'll let him set it all out with his presentation. But where we've gone ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and instead of at that time, even the first President Bush thought would be an era of peace and maybe disarmament and could cut the military by a third. We've now actually in a situation of greater tension and maybe more frightening a possibility of nuclear war than ever. And so this week, we really want to think about Russia's place in that view of the world and how we come to think about foreign policy. And Ray, I've asked the students to read Jeff Gerth's articles in the Columbia Journalism Review on the whole Russiagate scandal, which came to affect presidential politics because in the eyes of some, Donald Trump was considered to be something of an agent of Putin in Russia, and which enters into our current election. So I've asked Ray to come, and then on Wednesday we have Nick Cole from our own public diplomacy department, who has a somewhat different view, and so we'll get a range of opinions, analysis from two experts on international relations. So, Ray, do you want? Oh no, and you had an introduction that you wanted to make.
No, I mean, I guess I would.
You've met Dr. O'Connor, yes?
Well,
Yeah.
and I've been kind of trying to help moderate with the students and make sure that it's clear in this class
You hear, Ray?
Yeah, I can hear that.
Oh, yeah.
that we don't want anybody to feel like they have to be apologetic for not being familiar with a lot of the details of foreign policy in a context where they're not introduced to it. It's not something that people are encouraged to explore. In fact, the opposite, especially as high school students and even as undergraduate students. So that's the starting point. If there are things or elements of these discussions that are obscure or you don't know, that's really the point. And we want to make sure you feel comfortable asking those questions, whether in this setting in the classroom here or afterward one-on-one. But that's really where I'm coming from.
Okay, in the spirit of that, Ray is being very generous with his time, and so he's going to be with us through the whole period, right, Ray?
Right.
Yeah, and so I really would like class participation, and I want you to feel the confidence of challenging anything, think raising any question, not be intimidated by someone's claim to expertise, be it mine or Ray's or anybody else. So we're going to leave a good chunk of time after Ray's presentation for class involvement, and I keep bouncing around this. We do give credit for that. I want to give credit for that. Okay, yeah, participation, but I want people to participate and again, not to be intimidated that you have to agree with anything I've said or Ray's or Claire says or Max for that matter. We want to have a discussion about something we need a discussion about. We may be blowing up the world along with the Russians if we don't get this stuff straight. We're at a really critical moment. This is not just a hyperbole. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ray. Okay, and if I got something wrong in your biography, why don't you correct me?
Okay, no need for correction, but I must say at the outset that nothing I say should be interpreted as a part of what the United States government believes or says. That's a joke, folks. Actually, speaking of jokes, to wake us all up, I have one from World War II. It's very brief. Let me tell this apocryphal story. Hunts, the resistance fighter, very famous for being in Dachau and having an open window and shooting down 7 Nazi aircraft, 7 fighter bombers, okay? Very famous, came back after the war and was invited to University of California in Berkeley. You probably have heard of that place. Anyhow, they had a big crowd there. The whole stadium was filled, okay? And the chancellor of the university was there, introduced Hans. He said, now, Hans, you need no introduction. We've put circulars out, we've put flyers out. They know who you are. Take it away, Hans. Tell us about your experience shooting down those German planes. And Hans said, thank you very much, Herr Kanzler. Well, it's a very simple story. The Americans, they gave me this bazooka, this recoilless rifle, and I had a big window and I shot down 7 of those fuckers. And the audience was in quite a titter. And so the chancellor took the microphone and said, now, ladies and gentlemen, you're probably too young to realize that there were various aircraft manufacturers in Germany and Holland, and one of them was Messerschmitt. There was another in Holland that begins with. Anyhow, so yeah, Fokker was a manufacturing plant for German fighters. So Hans, take it away again. Hans says, thank you again, Herr Kanzler, and you are absolutely right. But these fuckers was flying Messerschmitts. Sorry about that, folks. That's one of my favorite jokes, okay? So I claim...
Not inviting an Irishman to class anymore. You gotta behave. This is a serious class, serious subject. Stop screwing around, okay?
Oh, okay, all right. Well, let me sort of enhance my credentials by asking Max, could you show that first slide, please, just to kind of give me some gravitas. I'm very much in need of gravitas. This would be the one with George Bush. Whoop, that's the last slide. It's okay. Well, what I did was brief a number of people. It was an accident of history. What happened was, there he is, George Bush and I looked a little younger then. So did he. Now, we were outside his vice president's office in those days, and that was my farewell to him. He invited a photographer to capture the moment. So I briefed him for 4 years during the first term of Ronald Reagan from 81 to 85. Could you have the next slide, please? Okay, now that's an exemplar of the cover sheet of the president's daily brief. My immediate boss, who kept me who kept me in place despite the wishes of his bosses, had carried this thing around right before I left, and they all put these very nice inscriptions on this exemplar of the cover of the president's daily brief. It doesn't contain the for the president only, eyes only, and all that stuff that usually is on the top. But those are the remarks. And, you know, I really like the ones on the right, because those are the ones, those George Bush, and I hope you can read it, and George Shultz, both of whom I found willing to listen to what I had to say with respect to prospects for Russia, and very skeptical of what my bosses, Bobby Gates and Bill Casey, had to say about prospects for Russia. Now, if you look at the left-hand side, well, I mean, those people were indicted. Bud McFarland was one of several national security assistants that lied. And of course, Weinberger was about to go to jail before President George H.W. Bush pardoned him as he went out of office. Last one there, Jack Vesey. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a really good guy, brown shoe soldier, battlefield commission during World War II, and willing to listen as well as those people on the right-hand side. So those are the people that I briefed every other morning. We worked in teams of two. May we have the next slide, please? Now, I'm not sure you can see this, but it's William B. Clark, who is the National Security Assistant Advisor to Reagan from, I think it was 82 to, yeah, January 82 to October 83. Now, the reason I mention it is you see me there third in line right after the White House staff meeting. And if you go down to the bottom, you see some pretty distinguished people like Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of Germany, and all kinds of stuff. So there I was in pretty august, well, my Irish grandmother would call that the muckety mucks. And she'd call them also the upper crust. And one time she says, "Now, Raymond, do you know the definition of the upper crust?" I said, "No, I don't." "Well, it's this. The upper crust is a bunch of crumbs held together by a lot of dough. Put that in your pipe and smoke it." So I was kept honest by my grandmother and the other people that watched over me from the Bronx. Now, one reason I call attention to Judge Clark, if we could move that thing up just a little bit, Max, is because he didn't stay very long in office, and because one more, if you can. Yeah, see, McGovern. Well, Clark is on there somewhere. Anyhow, Judge Clark was the person I briefed this particular day in 1983, and a high-level Soviet person, I think, was Chernenko, who later became Secretary General or General Secretary of the Communist Party. He showed some flexibility on that key issue of intermediate nuclear forces. We had Pershing missiles in the West. The Russians had SS-20s. The idea was, could we ever get the Russians to be more flexible? And sure enough, Chernenko, whoever it was, showed some flexibility, so showed some willing to make concessions. And guess what? I told Judge Clark that. Now, why do I stress that? Well, because Judge Clark was instinctively averse to hearing the word concession and Soviet in the same sentence. And so luckily, he was new in the job. And what I traditionally did was prepare a 2-minute briefing if they had questions, a 10-minute briefing if they were really interested, and a 20-minute briefing about how all this comes about. And he listened to the 20-minute briefing. And he was still quite surprised that the Russians would show flexibility on this key issue. But there it was. McGovern explained it. He said, "What's your number?" He gave him my secure number. I get back to headquarters and he calls me up. He said, "I want to talk some more about that." Meanwhile, Robert Gates, who's the director of all analysis, hears about this and tells Judge Clark's secretary, "Don't talk to McGovern, talk to me. I run the analysis here at CIA." End of my one-on-one with Judge Clark, Reagan's National Security Advisor. Now, why do I mention that? I mention that because a decent briefer of presidents or even college classes needs to have a 5-minute, a 10-minute, and a 20-minute presentation ready. And so I'm going to turn now to those slides that I sent you, Max, early on, and talk a little bit about my favorite subject, that is Ukraine. And I think in addition to the substantive information here, this is offered as an example of how I would brief Judge Clark or anyone else who would listen for 20 minutes. I won't do it for 20 minutes. I'll cut it short unless I see a lot of interest. But here's how you do the background on Ukraine, okay? You have to, now, I should say here, I haven't cleared this with Bob, but I'm sure this is on the final, okay? So take copious notes. November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, right? Whoops. What happens? George H.W. Bush sort of became a friend of mine after he left office and after I did. He sent his Secretary of State, James Baker, over to Moscow to figure out how they're going to handle the implosion of Eastern Europe and maybe the Soviet Union. And Baker says, here's the deal. Here's the deal. Okay. Now we want to.
Right. Let me just
Yeah.
interrupt you for a moment. This is a basic history lesson that our students need to hear. I dare say maybe our faculty as well. And so we have time today. You know,
Okay.
you're available till 11:50. And
Yeah.
so you remember, we're dealing with, the freshmen, sophomores, and so forth. Put yourself in their seats. Remember how little you knew when you were at Fordham University, right? It's your parochial education. But seriously, take longer rather than shorter, okay?
All right. Well, thanks, Bob. As you know, I'm Irish and I like to take longer rather than shorter. Okay, well, this is a key, this is a tectonic shift. November 9th, 1989. Many of you weren't born yet. That's okay, all right? The Berlin Wall falls, and 1 year later, 1 year plus, the Soviet Union falls apart into constituent parts which become separate countries like Ukraine. Now, next big benchmark is February 9th, 1990. But I have to tell you in a personal way, since we have a little time, that when that happened, I decided to retire. I clapped myself on the back. I said, way to go, Ray. We did it. We made the Soviet Union. No, it wasn't just you, Ray. It was a lot of people. But you can go now. You can go work in the inner city, which I had been volunteering in forever, and which I really wanted to do rather than what I had been doing. I had just become 50 years old, so I was able to retire with a reduced annuity, but that was okay. So I retired in the middle of January 1990, right in between when the Berlin Wall fell, and we have James Baker going to Moscow. All of us were just so joyous. The Soviet Union was no more. My God, there's going to be peace. George H.W. Bush talked about peace from Lisbon to Vladivostok. He talked about a whole complete Europe free and united. And Gorbachev, his counterpart, was really in on that deal. You know what happened? We'll talk a little bit more about that. But, we were just so happy. And when James Baker, the Secretary of State, that's the next year, February 9, when he went to Moscow, he said to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, he said, look, here's the deal. He was a Texas lawyer, okay? James Baker, okay? Smart guy. Okay? We want a reunited Germany. Now, many of you will not be able to identify with this, but Bob and I can. I don't know how Bob would have reacted, but I know how I reacted when I heard all this stuff going on. God, the Russians just lost 27 million people to a reunited Germany. That's a big quid. What was the quote that James Baker was willing to offer? Well, the quote was, cross our hearts hope to die, we won't move NATO 1 inch eastward beyond East Germany, the East German border at the time. Now, long since have the objections to that truth been dissipated. They're on the record in German official documents, our own Russian. In other words, that was the undertaking. We would not enlarge NATO beyond Germany to the east, and in return for that, the Russians could be persuaded to accept a reunited Germany. My God, Well, they did. They expected so much economic help for us. They Gorbachev or later Putin offered to join NATO, for God's sake. They didn't want a war with the West. Okay, so that was the quid and that was the quo.
Can I slow you down just because I want to make sure everybody understands this question of what promises were made around NATO's eastward expansion is central to this issue topic of today. And so I don't know if you want to expand a little bit just so people have a sense of what that means. Why was that promise so important?
Well, it was so important because it was welched on, so to speak, by Bill Clinton. Long story short, Bill Clinton decided that when he was running against Bob Dole, that Bob Dole was pretty powerful in the Midwest, in those key cornerstone states, battleground states, and that Clinton wanted to see if he could do better with the Polish, with the Hungarian, with the Czech and the Slovak votes there. A lot of those immigrants were there, right? And so he said, let's expand NATO and tell these countries out there and tell their compatriots here in the United States who will vote for me that we'll let them in NATO. My God, everyone thought that was crazy. Not only was it welching on a promise, but it was creating the conditions for a Soviet Union or Russia that would be implacably hostile to the movement of NATO to the east. Now, ironically, to bring that up to date, what was it that Kamala Harris said first thing? She said, if Putin is allowed to take Ukraine, he won't stop there. He'll take Poland and he'll go to the Baltics. And Poland, she's speaking in Pennsylvania, there are 800,000 people of Polish extraction here in Pennsylvania, and they wouldn't want that. So we're going to stop him before he moves there. Okay, so it's Clinton replayed here. They want so anyhow, they got the East European votes there. Clinton actually didn't need them, but that's what happened. So that's the background of when they called Jack Matlock, who's a good friend of mine. He was the ambassador to the Soviet Union, right? They called him in and they said, under Clinton, what will happen if we violate that promise that James Speck, you were there when he promised that, what will happen? And like, no sense at all. He said, this is crazy. This will, like George Kennan just said, this will create an impeccable Russia and might even cause hostilities, okay? Now, after he testified to that congressional committee, okay, staffers from that committee came up to Jack Matlock and said, Ambassador Matlock, we agree with you completely. I mean, all of us, including the senators here. But look, President or Clinton needs these votes. It's a political thing. You just gotta bend with the political flow here. How do I know that? Matlock told me, or he's told others as well. So that's the background of all this stuff about incorporating more people. The Russians didn't react very forcefully with the first tranches of new members, and that was because Yeltsin was in the bag. We actually helped him win in 1996. Actually, you don't have to believe me. Look at Time magazine with that famous picture of him with the American flag and a winning symbol. Okay, let's go to the next thing here. Now, we talked about 1990 and the promise, okay? Now we have a lot more, actually it doubled in size. NATO had been 16 and it was about 30 in 2008. And in 2008, there were rumors that Ukraine and Georgia would be incorporated in NATO. Okay, so what did that mean? Whoa, that meant niet. Okay, so what happened was there was an ambassador, our ambassador in Moscow, William Burns, now head of the CIA, was called into the Foreign Office there by the newly appointed foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Okay, he's still foreign minister. So he said, "Look, Mr. Burns, this business about Ukraine in NATO, niet means niet. If you take Ukraine into NATO, there will be a civil war in Ukraine, and we will have to decide whether we will be so provoked as to have to intervene with our military. We don't want to do that. So will you tell your people niet means niet? You will provoke us if you let Ukraine in NATO." Okay. Whoa. Okay. So Burns plays it straight. In the cable, which we have,
Ray, you
courtesy of-
should mention, that these were both part of the Soviet Union and the crossover of population, religion, why there would be a civil war. Well, I mean, why he's predicting that. The students,
well,
no, because one of the complexities is that you had a significant part of the population that identified with the Russian language and the Russian Orthodox Church and so forth in Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine itself was a construct of history, and there were competing populaces reflected by one president after the other. One would be a relatively pro-Russian president, the other would be relatively a pro-Western president. That's why we overthrew the duly elected president of Ukraine in 2014. And why that continued. We'll go to the next slide for that. But let me just, here we are, February 22nd, 2014. So there was a hiatus of, 6 years before Lavrov's warning, niet means niet, came into play, because the US and other Western services invested $5 billion, a billion with a B as in boy, dollars, in helping Ukraine's aspirations to join the West. And before you know it, there was a coup in Kiev. New people came in. The new coup leaders immediately said, "Let's join NATO and let's ban Russian as an official language." May we have the next slide, please? So that's a key date to remember. Okay, so that was the 14th. Now, in 2022, so we're talking February 14th was
I hate to interrupt you,
2014.
Ray, 'cause it's
Sure.
I want to again make it clear that part of what we're trying to share this week and encourage people to engage with critically is the distinction between the mainstream account of what happened in 2014 and the account that you're providing today, a dissident
Yeah.
account or a factual one. So I don't know if it's possible to kind of revisit what that mainstream story sounded like.
Well, we'll do that because we're also on Wednesday speaking with Nick Cole, and I just want to say all of this history is within your grasp and is to be contested, all of it. And as I keep saying, you can leave this class, go out, sit in the hallway for an hour and a half or so, Google the subject, and find different points of view. We're not presenting revealed truth from a higher almighty or something here. These are all contested points about history. And critical thinking, which is the motto of our department, the last time I looked, involves examining alternative views. All right. And this is hotly contested. And even Donald Trump in the current election presented a view of what's going on in Ukraine only a matter of days ago that the Democrats would fiercely disagree with. So yes, none of this, I mean, this is what understanding history is not a simple matter. Okay. But thanks to the internet, and here I'll be very positive about the internet. If you get beyond just looking for people who agree with you, and you look for the opposite story and to try to find different points of view, you can become quite expert on this by the end of the day compared to most people. If you actually spend some time today saying, is what Ray McGovern said true or not, or what's another view or another narrative, by 7 o'clock tonight, thanks to the internet, you will probably know more than most people you will encounter on this campus the next day. Yeah.
Well, you'll know more, but keeping in mind the other themes we've been discussing in this class about the function of narrative in statecraft. That is part of what we want to call attention to, and part of why I'm so grateful you're joining us today, Ray, is that we're trying to be able to identify when there's incentive to tell a story that benefits the state, that benefits the those who are trying to stoke feelings of nationalism, and on that basis moves away from certain facts or obscures them. And so when I say there's a mainstream account and there are dissident accounts, I'm saying be suspicious of that mainstream account. It's very important. It's not just a nobody can hear you.
Yeah, well,
The mic.
sure. Yeah. Claire and Bob, thanks very much. Let me tell you
Ray,
that when
Ray, the reason we begin with Orwell is because and this applies to every country in the world, right? And every period of modern history. All people or all over the world are systematically lied to by their official authorities. It's just built into the beast of power. Power lies. That's why we have a notion of separation of powers and limited government and First Amendment freedoms and the right to assemble. And so what I'm suggesting is, yes, a lot of this may be new or challenging information. And in the Jeff Gerth's articles, he tries to talk about the failure of the mainstream media. And it was in the Columbia Journalism Review. I think it's a very detailed, argued case that we have been pretty much deceived on these questions. As I say, Nick Cole on Wednesday will have well, I'm not going to tell him what to say, but quite possibly we'll have different points of view and certainly of emphasis.
Or people will just be encountering it in
Yeah,
mainstream
yeah,
discussions.
yeah. Okay. But then
Well,
again, it's not abstract history. It's basic to our election in the next few weeks. Because a major claim of the Democrats is that Trump is not protecting America's national security vis-a-vis Ukraine. And then, of course, Trump is also arguing the Democrats are not protecting America's national security vis-a-vis Israel. He's much more supportive of the U.S. having a strong pro-Israeli position. He's much more critical of the U.S. Having this position towards Ukraine. So I just want to say this is all up for debate. And the difficulty is then in a mass media driven society to figure out how you get information, how you can think about it critically. Critical thinking is an obligation of citizenship, but it's also an intellectual challenge, right? So take it away, Ray.
well, thanks, Bob, and thanks, Claire. I have to tell you that when I entered the CIA, there was a brand new building there in Langley, Virginia. This was 1963, and chiseled into the wall there in the foyer was, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." A verse from John's Gospel. Okay, I looked at that thing and I said, "My God, if that's true, no pun intended, this could be a good place to work." And I remember my grandmother's inculcation of this thing: be truthful and honest, and then you won't give a damn what anyone says about you. Period. End quote. Okay. And guess what, folks? During most of my career, it was that kind of place. Working on Soviet foreign policy was a joy because we could tell it like it is. And of course, That's why Truman founded the CIA. He wanted to hear what he called untreated intelligence, like it is from people who are responsible just to him, not to the State Department, not to the Pentagon. So let me just say that I don't disagree with anything Bob or Claire have just said, except what I am presenting to you are the facts. Now you can interpret the facts in different ways. That's true, but you can't adduce alternative facts. Remember Kellyanne Conway? Oh, these are alternative facts. There are no alternative facts. And so let's get right to it here. The Russians invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, 2022. Okay. Given what we explored just now in the first slide, would you say this is provoked or unprovoked? Okay. Well, you know that the byword for everyone in the administration, this was unprovoked. And yet Bill Burns was told on the 1st of February by the Russian foreign minister, if you try to accept Ukraine and NATO, this will provoke us. So that's 2008. Now Bill Burns, Bill Burns is a windsock, okay? Oh, it was unprovoked. Okay, now I'll say it's unprovoked. So that's what's leading the CIA now, a very malleable windsock, okay? Unprovoked. And besides, you wouldn't believe this, but in July of last year, Bill Burns said, Putin has lost this war in Ukraine. His armed forces have been disclosed as inept for all the world to see. Early July 2023. Oh, was he wrong about that? Of course he was. Did we know he was wrong? Of course we know he was wrong. Why was he saying that? I don't know. But right now, he's got to defend that in some way. Or why didn't he get fired? Well, it's another question. Let me just say that when we look at the facts, and please, nobody enter alternative facts. What I have displayed here, I can document chapter and verse. When the Russians forces invaded Ukraine, you have to decide for yourself, given these facts, whether it was provoked or whether it was unprovoked. Now, last thing here, but it's very necessary, is a quote from the outgoing, he just left last week, head of NATO, Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, okay? And what did he say in an unguarded moment when he was speaking to the EU Parliament? Look at what he said. Putin's precondition for not invading was no Ukraine in NATO. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent more NATO. End quote. May we have the next slide, please? Now, why is it that they don't want Ukraine in NATO? Well, there are already missile sites in Romania and Poland, and they can launch offensive strike missiles with only 5 minutes from launch to target, okay? If right now they can do it about 10 minutes. If the US gives hypersonic weapons to Ukraine, which Putin said they would on December 21st, 21, 5 minutes, okay? Now, this is fact, okay? That's what Putin said. Now, so what is it? That 9 days later, Putin or the Kremlin calls the White House and says, Putin wants to talk to Biden like right away. And to his credit, Joe Biden takes the call. Where was he? He was in Delaware. Who did he have with him? Maybe Hunter, but not his chief advisors, okay? So here we go. What did the readout from this call say? It said that Biden said to Putin, Washington has no intention to deploy offensive strike missiles, offensive strike weapons in Ukraine, period, end quote. This is a big break. New Year's Eve was never so joyous in Moscow. Ushakov was the main advisor to Putin here. Said, my God, they're recognizing our need for some security concerns. Okay.
Wait. Just let me play reporter before we lose the slide here.
Sure.
Did he say any not deploy offensive strike weapons or offensive nuclear strike weapons?
Well, the ones in Romania and Poland can fire nuclear-headed weapons. Okay.
No, I'm just saying Biden's statement would seem to be broader because the current issue is, will they be able to use offensive non-nuclear weapons to go deep into Russia? That's the impasse right now. Was Biden
right? Yeah.
Was Biden
That's
ruling?
That's a good question, Bob. And the answer is it's different. This is back in 21. We're now in 24. What they were talking about were the kind of weapons that were prohibited by the INF Treaty, and that it looked very much like, in addition to putting such weapons with nuclear capabilities in Romania and Poland already done, they were going to do it in Ukraine. And so when Putin on the 21st of December told his top military, including his Minister of Defense, look, they have us by the short hairs. If they put hypersonic, it's only 5 minutes from the ones in Romania and Poland to target, okay, to Moscow or ICBM forces. And, says Putin, the US will give hypersonic weapons to Ukraine. They don't make any sense without nuclear warheads. So that was the context of this whole thing. And that's the readout. If we go on here and say that Ushakov was very, very pleased, may we have the next slide, please? Okay, so that was the end of the previous year, December 30th, when that undertaking was made by Biden. The next time Biden and Putin, and the last time they talked to each other, the readout was Ushakov again announced it. The U.S. gave no meaningful response on the big issue, the deployment of strike weapon systems in Ukraine, or on NATO expansion. A couple of weeks before that, Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov, met with Tony Blinken in Geneva. The date was January 21. And when Lavrov said, okay, let's talk about prohibiting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, Blinken said, what are you talking about? Yeah, forget about that. That's not that. We're not going to do that. We might talk about limiting the number of them, but so there was a clear welching on that deal once again. No meaningful response on those. On February 16th, 2022, so when all this is going down, just before the invasion, may we have the next slide, please? Whoa, what's going on in the Donbass? Now, the Donbass, of course, is populated mostly by Russian stock, many Russian citizens, a lot of Russian people. And in February, the bulk of the Ukrainian army is massed near Donbass. No, that is not controversial. That's fact. On February 20 and February 16th, the shelling of Donbass starts to increase sharply. According to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, those are their figures. They had inspectors on the ground, and this is their report. If you look at the 14th, you have maybe 250 on the 600 plus on the 17th, and you're up to 1,400 on those bigger graph days. So what I'm showing here is that in addition to the offensive strike missiles, the people in Donbass were taking it on the chin from shelling by Ukrainian national forces, and 14,000 Russian stock people were killed in that shelling. Very few, comparatively speaking, were killed by the counter shelling by the folks to the degree they had weapons in Donetsk and Luhansk. May we have the next slide, please? So what happens? During this time of the increase in shelling and the welching on the deal, these are facts, people, Putin makes a big speech and he says, look, they're launching a blitzkrieg. And so what I'm going to do is recognize the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk. And they go ahead and they sign defense treaties with both these countries. Then 2 days later, Donetsk, Lugansk invoke the treaties. They say, come help us. Next day, Putin invokes Article 51 of the UN Charter, and he sends the troops in. Now, a little legal point here. Article 51 of the UN Charter is real, okay? I asked Richard Falk, the preeminent international lawyer, does Putin have a leg to stand on here? And he said, Ray, this is unsettled law. Got that, folks? Unsettled law. The US has done the equivalent. You can't just blithely say that it's unprovoked, nor can you say it's illegal, nor can you say the other adjective used, full scale. Putin went in with 95,000 troops to take over Ukraine. Give me a break. And the other part of the story, of course, is that as soon as they reached an agreement, 6 weeks into the war, the US and the UK put the kibosh on that agreement. And you don't have to believe me about that. Believe Victoria Nuland, who admitted to that with a smirk just 2 weeks ago in public. May we have the next slide, please? Now, this is just to indicate how sensitive the Russians would be. I'm making a comparison with the Cuban Missile Crisis 62 years ago. Now, we almost came to the end of the world then, and I can tell you, having just been called to active duty, U.S. Army intelligence infantry officer, I was at the infantry basic school at Fort Benning, Georgia. And guess what? There were no weapons to train on. I said, this is odd. I got up my courage and I said, hey, Sergeant, why aren't there any message and where are weapons? He said, oh, 2 divisions came through 2 weeks ago. They're all down in Key West, ready to go into Cuba. That's how close we came, folks. Now, why? Why was the U.S. so anxious about this? Well, look at what these missiles already in Poland and Romania can do. Now, they're already in place. They can reach Moscow. Well, let's see. You got 10 minutes for the ones way down in Romania. You got 9.3 minutes these are generic ballistic missiles, how long they would take, okay? As I've said before, when the US gets hypersonic missiles, it'll be 5 minutes, okay? So this is the existential threat that could come from these intermediate range ballistic missiles. Let's see the next slide, please. This is the comparison with Cuba. Now, just at this time, 62 years ago, October, we discovered that there were ballistic missiles, there were nuclear missiles in Cuba, and there are also bombers. That first little circle there, that's the range of the bombers with nuclear capability bombs, okay? So that was not much. The next one is the SS-4s, is it? Yeah, the SS-4s. And that you could almost reach Washington, all the naval bases on the East Coast, and the SS 5s would reach what you see the outer circle. Okay. What did the US do? The US said, no deal. Cuba, you can't accept these things. We're going to remove them unless the Russians remove them. And what did we do? Well, look down there in the left corner. You see those little blue boats there? Those are the good guys. That's the US Navy blockading the Russian delivery of these missiles. They got there just in time to prevent the SS-5s, that big circle, from getting into place, but the SS-4s were there. Blockade, my God, that's an act of war. Well, we called it a quarantine, okay? And so what happened? There were conversations conducted over teletype. Jack Matlock, my friend, was in Moscow translating what the Russians were saying and sending it back. So they were talking to each other. And finally, Khrushchev and Kennedy decided, hey, let's not blow up the rest of the world. Let's leave you something, Khrushchev, to step down easy. We'll remove those missiles we have in Turkey. That was a side deal done by Bobby Kennedy and Ambassador Dobrynin, okay? So they came to a peaceful solution. Now, the point of this whole thing is we have a Monroe Doctrine, and that was invoked here. The Russians just not allowed, the Chinese would not be allowed to put missiles in striking distance of the United States. No one said back in 1962, wait a second. Every country has the right to choose what alliances it has. Every country has the right to receive defensive weaponry to guard against invasion. Nobody said that at all. It was recognized to be an existential threat to the United States. Thank God, Khrushchev backed down. They removed the missiles, and we all breathed a sigh of relief. And I was able to spend my 2 years as a Army intelligence infantry officer in peace. Okay, so my point is, if we could show well, this is probably enough with these slides, just to show that when one major power, nuclear power, sees a existential threat, no matter what the laws are, they're going to do quarantine, they're going to do whatever it takes to remove that existential threat. And it is fact that Putin said on the 21st December, this is an existential threat. 5 minutes for these new missiles. We don't want that. You better really. And Stoltenberg, as I said in that second slide, said, no, well, they said they wouldn't invade if we stopped inviting inviting Ukraine into NATO. We refused, we declined, and so they invaded. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, now this needs to be said. There is a professor named John Mearsheimer. He is sort of the dean of the Realism School of International Relations. I happen to be a participant in that school, although it never occurred to me that I was while I was working at the CIA. And what he said 10 years ago, mind it, 10 years ago in the very prestigious Foreign Affairs magazine titled Why Ukraine.
Why don't you explain what you mean by the realism school?
Okay. Well, I'm afraid, Bob, that I'm so ignorant of these schools that I thought there was only one school, and it was the realistic school. Now I'm told there's the ideological school, and there's the great power school, and we can do whatever we want school. But Mearsheimer is golden when he says, "Look, this is the situation. Why Ukraine crisis is the West's fault. Foreign Affairs, quote, the US NATO now face a choice on Ukraine. They can exacerbate hostilities with Russia and devastate Ukraine, or they can work to create a prosperous but neutral Ukraine." Okay, that's what he said 10 years ago. What did he say just last May at a public presentation? look, Putin invaded Ukraine with great reluctance. Okay. What Mearsheimer says is it was not unprovoked. Putin invaded Ukraine, as Stoltenberg admits, because Putin was provoked. Now, Mearsheimer continues, I do not think he had any other options. He was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement so they wouldn't have to invade. Now, for the Minsk agreements, those of you who need to know about those, after the first year of the war, after the coup in Kiev, the two sides were slugging it out against each other, killing all kinds of people, and they agreed to kind of a ceasefire and a ceasefire line. And Germany and France undertook to guarantee that the Ukrainian constitution, Ukraine was also involved, their representatives, the Ukrainian constitution would be changed to allow a degree of self-rule for the Donbass, the Lugansk and Donetsk. Okay, now that was concluded in Minsk, Belarus, twice. The last time in 2015. But guess what? It turns out that Angela Merkel of Germany and François Hollande were diddling the Russians. How do I know that? Because Angela Merkel and François Hollande admitted that the Minsk thing was simply a delaying tactic to allow NATO to build up the Ukrainian army to as good as it was 8 years later. They said that in public. They said, ha, 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 we treated the Russians. Look at them now. They're going to have to fight against a NATO-equipped, a NATO-trained, a NATO army, maybe the greatest one in Europe. And so, that's how the Minsk agreements came out as far as the Russians are concerned. So the Russians are not going to settle for being diddled on Minsk, being diddled on offensive strike missiles, or being diddled on not moving NATO 1 inch to the east anymore. I think there's one more slide here. May we have the next slide, please? Okay. Can you play that? This is a more jovial rendition of a YouTube thing by Matterfield. Well, that may be an ad or something. I don't know. This is a kind of a collection of how, yeah, here we go. I think that's good. Well, is it?
Actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders.
Flashback.
This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It's never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
Absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
He's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
Okay, I think we can stop it there. We could stop it there, Max. Thank you very much. Well, let's.
So let me just say, okay, now this is laying out an argument, an analysis. Okay.
No, it's the facts.
I know,
It's
Ray.
not the analysis.
Oh, you analyze the facts and what conclusion you come to. I agree with you, by the way. It's not really, well, at the end, you showed people denying what is a fact. Is it about NATO expansion or not? That is a question that should be factually argued. did we want to expand NATO? And is there any conceivable way that could be seen as a threat to Russia? That is an argument that's based on facts. But I want to get something across here, because finding the truth in any of these situations is a confusing, difficult, challenging process. And anybody who tells you otherwise is preparing you to be deceived. And I've spent the whole lifetime trying to figure this stuff out. And anybody who tells you it's all so clear, yes, I agree with what Ray is saying. I think reasonable people should be able to at least agree on what the facts are.
Yeah.
I agree with you, but how you use these facts, how you make your argument, what the larger perspective is, that's all very much up for legitimate debate, contention, examination. And I want to keep that in focus, okay? Whatever we're talking about. Next week, when we talk about Israel, clearly you'll have different narratives, different assortment of facts, and so forth. You want to have these debates with respect for the facts, and also for then logically, in an informed way, examining what that all means. And so that's the first thing. But I really wish people would participate, and even to the degree of saying you don't give a damn, or it's beyond your interests, or why are we talking about this rather than the disastrous outcome of USC's last football game or any other thing, okay? And the only thing I want to insist on here is that we would be failing in your education if we, in a school of communication, let alone journalism, did not examine our perception of reality that concerns the most important existential question, which is the survival of life on the planet. It couldn't be any more compelling as a subject. If you go to a university at this time in our history, and you don't discuss global warming as an existential threat to our climate, which we see all around us, if you don't discuss the possibility of nuclear war, and the amount of, without nuclear weapons, of violence against civilians going on in Ukraine now, and going on in, obviously, in Gaza and Lebanon and West Bank and so forth, then it's irresponsible education. How we got to that point is what the contention is about. And if using academic skills and disciplines and restraints and standards does not get you closer to the truth about it, then what is the value of education? The other thing I want to throw in is that people get invested in their arguments. And they get invested in their arguments sometimes for self-interest, their career, their profit, the war industry, what Eisenhower warned about, or what have you. So we can't always assume good faith. And I want to giving that little editorial, because we present something here in our school, critical thinking or objective research, search for the truth, reject false information. And the reason I wanted you to read Jeff Gertz's article on Russiagate is not for you to agree with Jeff Gertz's conclusion, but just to recognize that in a responsible, peer-reviewed journal, the Columbia Journalism Review, probably the leading one, I mean, arguably, it's certainly the leading one in the field, and a leading Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Jeff Gertz, that lays out something that has dominated our politics all the time that you've been in high school and college, this Russiagate thing, you know, is not simple. Not simple, that's all, and how you figure it out. So could you come up here and use these microphones? Or Max, can we pass? I need you up there, but can we pass mics around? How do you want to do this? We have time. We have somebody here. You can challenge him. You can raise questions about it. Any of you think this should be an issue or is an issue in the election? Do you think Trump is a puppet of Putin, for example? Do you think the U.S. should be more aggressive in supporting Ukraine, whether Democrats or what is going on? Anyone? Yeah, could you come up? Great. And please don't drop this class. I really need you. Thank you. Joe, go ahead.
Bob, I have a little mini case study having to do with Russiagate, which would take me 5 minutes after at some point in the Q&A.
Sure. You're being very generous with your time, so you do it whichever way you want. But I do want to get, look, if none of this matters to students at a leading university, it only means because we don't have a draft. It only means because you think you can have these wars around the world and kill lots of people, maybe finish all life on the planet, and that you don't have agency or there's nothing you can do to figure it out. It's really just that simple.